January 9th, 1942. South of Manila, a captured Willis Jeep idles in the mud. A Japanese lieutenant climbs in just to test it, and it outruns his entire recon column. Suspension that swallows the jungle, an engine that keeps running when everything else breaks. For Japanese engineers, this wasn't a curiosity, it was a proof. America wasn't just fighting with men, it was fighting with factories. One small vehicle, mass-produced by a nation that could replace losses by the hour, revealed a truth the empire failed to see. Watch the full story, because the sound of that Jeep's engine was the first hint that the war had already shifted.
January 9th, 1942. Somewhere in the green hills south of Manila, beneath a canopy still wet from the night's rain, a convoy of Type 95 Kurogane reconnaissance vehicles sat idle along a narrow jungle road. The air smelled of diesel and damp earth. Inside the lead vehicle, Lieutenant Takeda Hiroshi of the Imperial Japanese Army's 14th Infantry Division wiped condensation from a pair of field binoculars and studied the abandoned American position ahead. The silence was not peaceful. It carried the weight of something unfinished, a war not yet won, despite all assurances to the contrary. The Philippines had fallen faster than Tokyo planners had dared to predict. In the span of 4 weeks, Japanese forces had pushed American and Filipino defenders from the beaches at Lingayen Gulf down into the Bataan Peninsula, a shrinking pocket of resistance that grew more desperate with each passing day. Yet, amid the wreckage of retreat, burned supply dumps, overturned trucks, hastily abandoned foxholes, Imperial Army engineers and intelligence officers were beginning to notice something that troubled them more than they cared to admit. The Americans, even in defeat, left behind equipment that spoke of an industrial capacity Japan could not match. And among these artifacts of withdrawal, none proved more humbling than a small angular vehicle with 4 wheels, no doors, and a name stenciled in white paint across its hood: Willys. The Jeep, a quarter-ton reconnaissance vehicle so ubiquitous in American service that soldiers rarely thought twice about it. Yet, to Japanese engineers encountering it for the first time in the jungles of Southeast Asia, this simple machine became a revelation and a warning they were not yet prepared to heed. Lieutenant Takeda did not know, as he climbed down from his Kurogane and walked toward the captured American Jeep sitting motionless in the mud, that he was about to confront a truth the Imperial General Staff had never planned for: that wars are not won solely by the courage of men or the sharpness of their swords, but by the factories that can turn steel into mobility and mobility into inevitable victory. Japan had entered the war with confidence born of swift conquest. By the winter of 1942, the rising sun flew over Hong Kong, Manila, Singapore, and Rangoon. The empire stretched across a quarter of the globe, and its soldiers, hardened by years of fighting in China, believed themselves invincible. They had been told they fought for a divine cause, that their spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. Yet spirit, however fierce, cannot outrun an engine. And in the early months of the Pacific War, Japanese reconnaissance units were beginning to realize that the enemy they had so quickly pushed back possessed something far more dangerous than bravery. They possessed production. The Kurogane, Japan's primary scout vehicle, was a marvel of pre-war engineering for its time. A compact 3-wheeled motorcycle variant, later expanded to 4 wheels, it weighed just over 1,000 pounds and could navigate narrow trails with the agility of a man on foot. It was designed for a war of limited resources, for an army that valued frugality and endurance over comfort. Its engine, a modest 1,200cc air-cooled unit, produced 33 horsepower. It could carry 2 men, perhaps 3 if supplies were left behind. It had no suspension worth mentioning, no power to speak of when climbing hills under load, and a top speed, on good roads, of 50 miles per hour, a figure that assumed good roads existed, which, in the jungles of the Pacific, they rarely did. But the Kurogane had one virtue the Imperial Army valued above all else. It was Japanese. It was built by hand in small numbers, assembled with care, and distributed sparingly to units deemed worthy of mechanization. In 1942, the entire Japanese military possessed fewer than 5,000 motorized reconnaissance vehicles of all types. This was not a design flaw. It was a reflection of an economy that could not produce more. Takeda crouched beside the Jeep and ran his hand along its front fender. The metal was cold, slick with moisture, but unmarked. No dents, no rust. It had been abandoned in haste, but not damaged. He noticed immediately that the vehicle was larger than his Kurogane, wider across the frame, heavier by half. Yet when he gripped the steering wheel and rocked the chassis, it moved with surprising ease. The suspension absorbed his weight without protest. He looked underneath and saw leaf springs, thick and purposeful, designed not for elegance but for punishment. This was not a vehicle built to impress, it was built to work. Records from the Imperial Army's Technical Intelligence Bureau, recovered after the war, revealed that the first captured Jeeps were brought to field workshops in Luzon and Malaya for detailed examination. Engineers dismantled engines, measured tolerances, tested materials. What they discovered was both instructive and disheartening. The Jeep's four-cylinder Willys L-head engine produced 60 horsepower, nearly double that of the Kurogane, from a displacement only slightly larger. It was water-cooled, rugged, and built to run for thousands of miles with minimal maintenance. The vehicle weighed 2,450 pounds fully loaded, yet it could carry half a ton of cargo or tow a 37mm anti-tank gun without strain. It had four-wheel drive, a feature the Kurogane lacked entirely, allowing it to climb grades and traverse mud that would strand lighter vehicles. Its top speed exceeded 65 miles per hour on flat ground, and more importantly, it could sustain that speed for hours without overheating. But numbers alone do not convey the psychological impact of the Jeep on those who faced it. What troubled Japanese engineers most was not the vehicle's performance in isolation, but what it represented. A production system so vast, so mechanized, that America could afford to build them not in thousands, but in hundreds of thousands. By the end of 1942, Willys and Ford together were producing Jeeps at a rate of one every 2 minutes. Japan, by contrast, would manufacture fewer than 5,000 Kuroganes during the entire war, a number the United States exceeded in a single week. Takeda turned the ignition key, someone had left it in the dashboard, and the engine coughed to life on the first try. It settled into a low, steady idle, a sound more mechanical than musical, but utterly reliable. He shifted into gear and pressed the accelerator. The Jeep lurched forward, not gracefully, but with a kind of blunt, irresistible force. Within seconds, he was moving faster over the rutted jungle trail than his Kurogane had ever managed. The suspension absorbed impacts that would have shaken his teeth loose in a Japanese vehicle. The steering was heavy but responsive. And the engine, gods, the engine had power to spare. He drove for less than a mile before turning back. But in that brief circuit, Lieutenant Takeda understood something that no amount of propaganda could erase. The Americans had not been beaten. They had merely withdrawn. And when they returned, they would bring with them an ocean of steel. The Japanese imagined victory in 1942 as a matter of willpower. They had trained for years to endure hardship, to march farther, eat less, fight harder than any Western soldier could bear. They believed, because they had been taught to believe, that material superiority was a crutch for the spiritually weak. The samurai did not count swords before a battle, he simply fought. And so the Imperial Army advanced across Asia with confidence born not of factories, but of faith. Yet faith, however fervent, cannot carry supplies up a mountain. It cannot repair a broken axle in the rain. It cannot transform a 3,000-mile supply line into a functioning logistics network when every ton of fuel must be carried by hand, by mule, or by vehicles that break down every 50 miles. The Americans understood something the Japanese command did not. that modern war is a contest of logistics before it is a contest of courage, and that the side which can move faster, supply more, and replace losses quicker will prevail regardless of spirit. The Jeep was the embodiment of this philosophy. It was not designed to inspire, it was designed to work. Its engine was simple enough that a mechanic with basic tools could rebuild it in the field. Its parts were interchangeable across hundreds of thousands of units, meaning that a broken axle in Burma could be replaced with one scavenged from a wreck in North Africa. It required no special fuel, no rare alloys, no hand-fitted components. It was mass production incarnate, a vehicle built by workers who would never see the jungles where it fought, shipped across oceans in holds packed so tightly that they arrived stacked 3 high, and issued to units so abundantly that losing one was an inconvenience, not a tragedy. By March of 1942, Japanese forces occupying the Dutch East Indies began encountering Jeeps in numbers that defied their understanding of American logistics. Intelligence reports from the 16th Army, stationed in Java, noted with alarm that retreating Allied forces appeared to possess motor transport in quantities greater than Japan's entire Southeast Asian Expeditionary Force. Captured manifests from Allied supply depots revealed shipments of vehicles numbering in the thousands, not as special equipment for elite units, but as standard issue for ordinary infantry divisions. One report, filed by a Major Yamashita and preserved in post-war archives, noted with barely concealed frustration, "The enemy treats motor vehicles as expendable. They abandon serviceable trucks rather than delay their retreat by hours. This suggests reserves we cannot comprehend." He was correct. By mid-1942, the United States was producing more military vehicles in a single month than Japan would manufacture during the entire war. The gap was not incremental, it was existential. And nowhere was this disparity more visible than in the contrast between the Kurogane and the Jeep. Japanese soldiers in the field quickly learned to scavenge abandoned American vehicles whenever possible. Captured Jeeps were prized beyond measure, not merely for their performance, but because they represented a kind of mobility Japanese logistics could not provide. A platoon equipped with a captured Jeep could patrol twice the area, carry twice the ammunition, and respond to threats twice as fast as one limited to foot movement or the fragile Kurogane. In the dense jungles of New Guinea, where roads existed only as muddy tracks carved by hand, Jeeps captured from Australian or American forces became the most valuable loot a Japanese unit could acquire. But using enemy equipment came with costs beyond the practical. Every Japanese soldier who climbed into a captured Jeep and felt its engine surge beneath him, every mechanic who opened its hood and marveled at the simplicity of its design, every officer who watched it climb a hill his own vehicles could not manage, each of them learned the same quiet, demoralizing lesson. We are not winning because we are stronger. We are winning because they have not yet decided to stop us. The symbolism of the Jeep extended beyond mechanics. In the hands of American forces, it became a tool of something Japan could not replicate: abundance. Where Japanese soldiers were taught to revere scarcity, to see hunger as discipline and deprivation as virtue, American troops operated within a logistical system that treated comfort as a right, not a luxury. A Jeep did not merely transport men, it transported the assumption that fuel would always be available, that parts would always arrive, that if one vehicle broke, another would replace it by morning. This assumption, invisible to those who lived within it, was more demoralizing to the enemy than any weapon. In the mountains of New Guinea, Japanese infantry learned to recognize the sound of a Jeep's engine from miles away, a low, steady hum that meant American patrols were near, that supply lines were functioning, that the enemy possessed freedom of movement their own commanders could only envy. The sound became a kind of auditory reminder that the war they thought they were winning was already lost in the factories of Detroit, where the same assembly lines that once built sedans now produced Jeeps at a pace Japan could not hope to match. By late 1942, the Imperial Army's Technical Intelligence Bureau produced a classified report on captured American vehicles. The document, marked secret and circulated only among senior staff, made several conclusions that would prove prophetic. It noted that American motor transport was designed for mass production by semi-skilled labor using standardized parts. It observed that the enemy's logistical doctrine prioritized mechanical reliability over weight savings or fuel efficiency. And it concluded, with clinical detachment, that Japan's current production capacity was insufficient to compete on equal terms with American motor vehicle output. The report recommended increased domestic production of reconnaissance vehicles, expanded training for motor transport units, and the development of new models capable of matching American performance. None of these recommendations were implemented. Japan's industrial base, already strained by years of war in China and the demands of naval construction, lacked the capacity to retool for mass production of motor vehicles. Steel that might have built trucks was instead poured into battleships. Factories that could have assembled engines were repurposed for aircraft production. And so the Kurogane remained in service, unchanged and inadequate, while American Jeeps multiplied across the Pacific like cells dividing. Each one a small, mobile reminder that Japan was fighting an enemy whose strength lay not in the courage of its soldiers, but in the output of its factories. There is a photograph taken sometime in 1943 that survives in the archives of the U.S. National Archives. It shows a Japanese Type 95 Kurogane and an American Jeep parked side by side on a captured airfield in the Solomon Islands. The Kurogane sits low to the ground, compact and angular, its narrow tires caked with mud. The Jeep beside it looks almost comically robust by comparison. Wider, taller, heavier, its thick tires and rugged frame suggesting a vehicle built for punishment rather than elegance. An American soldier stands between them, one hand resting on the Jeep's hood, his expression unreadable. The photograph was likely taken as a trophy image, a bit of visual propaganda to send home. But it captures, perhaps unintentionally, the essence of the Pacific War's industrial imbalance. Two vehicles, two philosophies, two nations, and only one with the factories to sustain its ambitions. Japanese engineers who survived the war and were interviewed decades later spoke with a mixture of admiration and bitterness about the Jeep. They acknowledged its brilliance as a design, simple, rugged, effective. But they also noted, with the clarity that only hindsight allows, that the Jeep's true genius lay not in its engineering, but in its production. A brilliant vehicle built in small numbers is a curiosity. The same vehicle, built in the hundreds of thousands, becomes a strategic weapon. One former engineer, interviewed in the 1970s, recalled his first encounter with a captured Jeep in the Philippines. "We thought," he said, "that if we could just copy its design, we might build something comparable. But when we calculated the factory capacity required to produce it in meaningful numbers, we realized the Americans were not simply ahead of us in design, they were ahead of us in everything. They had the steel, they had the machine tools, they had the trained workers, and they had the will to use all of it, without hesitation, without reservation. We were fighting a war with the resources of a regional power. They were fighting with the resources of a continent." By 1944, the strategic situation had reversed entirely. American forces, supplied by fleets of cargo ships and supported by logistical networks that stretched from California to the front lines, advanced across the Pacific with a speed and coordination that Japanese planners had once believed impossible. Every Marine division, every Army regiment, every airborne unit moved with the support of thousands of vehicles, jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, amphibious tractors, each one a product of the same industrial system that had seemed so distant and irrelevant in the heady days of 1941. Japanese forces, by contrast, found themselves increasingly immobile. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and stranded vehicles. Supply lines, stretched across thousands of miles of hostile ocean, collapsed under the weight of American submarines and air attacks. Units that once advanced with confidence now dug in and waited, knowing that reinforcement was unlikely and retreat impossible. And in the rare moments when Japanese soldiers encountered American positions, they saw jeeps everywhere, parked beside command tents, racing along jungle trails, towing artillery, carrying wounded, delivering ammunition. The vehicle that had once been a curiosity was now a ubiquitous symbol of an enemy that could afford to waste what Japan could not afford to build. The Kurogane, meanwhile, faded into obsolescence. By the war's final year, most had broken down beyond repair, their parts scavenged to keep a dwindling few operational. Those that remained in service were used sparingly, hidden from air attack, driven only when absolutely necessary. They had become relics of a war Japan thought it could win through spirit alone. There is a passage in the diary of an unnamed Japanese officer recovered from a battlefield on Luzon in 1945 that captures the transformation that knowledge of American abundance wrought on those who fought without it. He wrote, "We were told that the Americans were soft, that they could not endure hardship, that they would break under pressure. But I have seen their vehicles, and I no longer believe what we were told. A nation that builds such things in such numbers is not soft. It is simply confident, and confidence, when backed by factories, is a kind of strength we cannot defeat." The Jeep did not win the Pacific War. No single vehicle, no single weapon could claim such a thing. But it represented, in metal and motion, the underlying truth that decided the conflict's outcome. That modern war is won not by the side that fights hardest, but by the side that can sustain its fighting longest. Japan fought with courage, discipline, and a willingness to endure suffering that few armies in history have matched. But courage cannot be mass-produced. Discipline cannot be shipped across oceans in cargo holds. And suffering, however nobly born, does not build roads or carry supplies or replace losses. The Americans understood this. They built their war effort not on the mythology of the warrior, but on the reality of the assembly line. They treated logistics as a weapon, mobility as a strategy, and abundance as a form of intimidation. And in doing so, they created a military machine that could absorb losses, adapt to setbacks, and advance with a grinding, inexorable momentum that no amount of Japanese resolve could stop. The lieutenant who first drove that captured jeep south of Manila in January 1942 survived the war. He was taken prisoner in the final weeks of fighting on Luzon and spent 3 years in an American POW camp in the Philippines. In interviews conducted decades later, he recalled that brief drive in the captured vehicle with a clarity that time had not dimmed. "I knew then," he said, "that we were going to lose. I did not know when, I did not know how, but I knew. Because if the Americans could afford to abandon something so valuable, it meant they had more. And if they had more of this, they had more of everything." It is tempting to view the Jeep as merely a tool, a piece of equipment no more significant than a rifle or a radio. But tools shape the armies that wield them, and armies shape the wars they fight. The Jeep shaped the American military into a force defined by mobility and abundance. It allowed commanders to think in terms of rapid movement, deep penetration, and logistical flexibility. It freed infantry from the tyranny of distance and allowed them to cover ground that would have taken days on foot. And it did all of this not as a special capability reserved for elite units, but as a standard feature of ordinary service, a baseline expectation that every soldier, regardless of rank or role, could assume. Japan never developed an equivalent. It never could. The industrial base required to produce vehicles in such numbers did not exist, and by the time its absence became undeniable, it was too late to build one. The war was decided not in the jungles of Guadalcanal or the beaches of Iwo Jima, but in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles, where workers who never saw combat turned steel into victory. And so the captured Jeep sat in the motor pool of a Japanese engineering unit, driven occasionally, studied endlessly, and eventually abandoned when fuel ran out and replacement parts could not be found. It rusted slowly in the tropical air, its olive-drab paint fading to gray, its tires rotting in the heat. When American forces retook the area months later, they found it half buried in vines, stripped of anything useful, a monument to a lesson learned too late. The engineers who examined it had been stunned, not by its complexity, but by its simplicity. They had expected a marvel of advanced engineering, some secret technology that explained American success. What they found instead was something far more troubling, a vehicle designed not to impress, but to endure. A vehicle built by a nation that understood that wars are won not by heroes, but by supply chains, not by swords, but by factories, not by the few, but by the many. The Jeep was freedom machined into steel, freedom to move, to supply, to replace, to continue. It was the mechanical embodiment of a society that believed abundance was not a sin, but a strength. And in the hands of men who had been taught to revere scarcity, it became proof that the war they thought they were winning had been lost before it began. The sound of a Jeep's engine echoing through the jungles of the Pacific was not merely the sound of a motor running. It was the sound of inevitability, of a future already written, of a victory already decided, of a truth too large to deny. And for those who heard it and understood what it meant, it was the loneliest sound in the world.